Okay, my friends, we are jumping into chapter 12 and 13, combined two chapters this unit. So there will be not a ton on the blood. It's basically this diagram and what the pieces and what they do. And then we'll talk about the cardiovascular system and how it works, okay? So if you want to start here, this diagram is on page 330 in your textbook. We're in, like I said, chapter 12, talking about the blood. I'll give you a study guide. Yeah, I promise. Yep, I just don't have it ready for you yet. Yep. Basically, chapter 12. Thank you. That's 4 times, guys. Okay. I need your attention. I know you're excited to see each other. It was a long weekend. You didn't converse or talk at all. I just need your attention. I appreciate it. The blood, I think, is one of the more interesting pieces of our bodies. You don't think of it as being all that excited because it's just blood, right? But there's so many little things that go into that. So much of the homeostasis of our body is maintained by the blood and by the various pieces and components that make it up. So again, this is, I think, a fantastic diagram that walks us through what the blood is made of, because you maybe didn't realize that blood has multiple pieces. It's not just blood. Well, it is blood, but I'm saying it's made of multiple things, right? So there's a nice, again, if you're on page 330, there's a little test tube that shows you, basically, if we were to draw your blood, right? Think about the little test tube of blood you get when you draw blood. And you were to take it and put it in a centrifuge and spin it super fast. And the physics folks, like way faster than we were spinning today, right? What would happen is it would separate. The heavier things would move toward the bottom of the tube. The lighter things, the less dense, would be toward the top. And you would have something that looks like that test tube on page 330. The top layer would be kind of this yellowish, clearish stuff, which would be the plasma. You'd have this little tiny layer of white, which they call the buffy coat, the platelets, the white blood cells, and then the bottom you'd have these red blood cells. I don't think there's a good picture on the lecture PowerPoint. Basically, you better look at page 330 in your textbook. And this is kind of showing you the pieces of the blood in the simplest form. So let's, sorry? So there's not that many white blood cells? No, there's not. No. The vast majority of your blood is plasma. Is that why when people bleed out so we'll talk a bit more about that. The plasma is just trying to increase the volume of the blood. Like they've lost so much, this is a way that you can help, like in trauma situations, get more blood volume. You still need the whole blood. Does that make sense? If I'm just giving you plasma, eventually that's going to be a problem. You need the other pieces too. Do you have to like match blood types? You do. So is all the plasma the same? The plasma, that's a good question. I am fairly certain there is no typing as far as that goes. I don't know, to be honest with you. I've not ever heard of any difficulties with the plasma. But I'll have to check on that one. Yeah, it's a good question. All right, so if you look percentage-wise, which is more, the formed elements or the plasma? Plasma, 55 to 45. Which, does that kind of surprise you? And plasma is mostly what? If you look on the percentages on the chart, what does it say? It's mostly water. 92% of that 55%. So you can do the math. That'd be what, like about 50%, right? A little more than 50% of your blood is water. Which is interesting. Maybe you didn't realize that was the case. A significant amount of water that's present. If we go back to the formed elements, sir. Sure. So your blood volume is going to drop. In other words, it won't be as much blood present there, which means it also gets more concentrated, which can, again, throw off some of the levels as far as pH, as far as electrolytes. Yeah, you've got to stay hydrated, certainly. So let's talk about these formed elements. 3 categories you can put these formed elements into. Number 1, are the platelets. Well, let's come back to that one. Let's go to red blood cells, because that's what 95% of the blood is, of the formed elements, are these red blood cells. What's the point? Give me just a minute. What are the points? What's the point of these red blood cells? They carry oxygen. They do lots of other pieces, but that would be, I would say, their main function, right? To carry oxygen from the lungs, when you breathe it in, to every other cell in your body, right? The question.
With the hormones in the plasma, why is that such a
Again, hormones are super potent, right? So you only need a tiny little bit of them to do the functions they need. Yep. So continuing on, the red blood cells. And notice they have this kind of concave shape to them on page 331. They show you a very good view of what these blood cells look like, right? Circular with kind of that indentation. Look like a button. That's always what I thought of when I saw these. Or like a donut that somebody forgot to finish cutting the hole out of the middle all the way. Right? It was like they just pushed it in, like the little Pillsbury Doughboy. Hee-hee. Push it in, right? That's what it makes me think of. And again, they're shaped this way to provide lots of surface area so that the oxygen can attach to these guys. You've heard of sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease. They talk in the box on page 331 about that. It's basically that these blood cells have a shape more like a half moon. And so they can't carry as much oxygen, number one. And number two, they tend to clot. They tend to clump together in ways that cause significant problems. Everywhere from just pain, like they get caught specifically in joints, big joints like hips and knees and shoulders, backs. And if they clot too much, or there's too much of those sickle cells in certain areas, it can actually cause the blood flow to that area to stop. And so you start having tissue dying because it can't get blood flow. It can't get blood that's bringing oxygen enough to make the tissue stay alive. Quite a serious piece to deal with. The next piece in the formed elements is that platelets. Again, 4.8%, about 5% of those formed elements. Yes, ma'am. Please. So when you're born, that little piece of the umbilical cord that is kept, and even inside there is a higher concentration of stem cells. Remember, stem cells are undifferentiated cells, that they can grow into basically anything. So there is a whole industry about let's collect that cord blood, they call it, and keep it so that I have now stem cells for you. And if you, in the future, we can grow organs from your stem cells, we take those and bada boom, here's a new liver for you. Now, we're not at that point yet, but there's certainly folks that will let you pay them to keep that in the hopes that we can do that. Does that make sense? Because there are stem cells there, but how can we use them yet? There's whole issues as far as that goes. Good question. So what do platelets do? Anybody know off the top of your head? Platelets. Right, they actually help the clotting of your blood, which is quite an amazing process. Think about this for a second. If I cut myself, do I want that clot to happen? Do I want it to be slow or fast? Right, okay, the faster the better, right? Do you want your blood to clot when you aren't cut? No. Do you see the inherent problem here? We want blood that will very quickly clot when it is exposed to the air or exposed to oxygen, right? We want blood that will not clot when it's not. Are you with me? Which is a very fine line to try and walk. Pardon me a second. I think I mentioned to you the book by Dr. Michael Behe called Darwin's Black Box. Basically, where he proposes these things that he calls irreducibly complex. These are processes in the body that if you remove one piece, the whole system falls apart. And he proposes that blood clotting is one of these irreducibly complex systems. If you were to read the detail. And we know all this. This is all just biochemistry. How clotting takes place. It's like a 1,000-step process. And I'm not kidding you. If you remove any one of those steps, the clotting won't happen, right? So he proposes this as being a sign that we were intelligently designed, because how could all of those pieces come together randomly in a way that would do this? This is one of his theses. What do we call, by the way, a blood clotting when you don't want it to be in your brain? No, aneurysm is when the blood vessel bursts. A stroke. A stroke is a blood clot in your brain. What do we call a blood clot in your heart? A heart attack, right? It's gotten, not always just blood clots, but I call this being narrowing of those vessels. Oh, how about in your lungs? Anybody know? It's like a pulmonary embolism is what we call that. That's a bad thing. A blood clot in your legs, right? So you've heard about these DVTs, deep vein thromboses, that all of these things can kill you, right? So blood clots are bad unless, you cut yourself. Then they're really good. It's a strange balancing act. So it can depend. Normally you think of blood clots in places you don't want them to be more of an older folk thing. But certainly if there are problems with the blood, and you'll see that there's a bunch of different things that affect this, it can certainly affect young people as well. Yeah. So normally what they want to do, are you comfortable if something is bleeding actively, it's very difficult to see as a surgeon. So once they slice, what they do, and I'm really not kidding you, they take a little, it's called cauterizing. They literally burn the blood vessel closed so it won't keep bleeding into the area where they're trying to work. Sometimes it depends on how big the blood vessel is. Yeah. So they will actively help the blood flow from continuing to happen. They want you to keep blood flow to the area, but not get blood into the field where they're trying to work. Does that make sense? So, it's a good question. So again, if they're big enough, then yes, they would just kind of clamp them off. But otherwise, they'll let the body just heal as they put it back together. No, it does damage it, yes. The hope is that it'll just grow back together again once you put the two tissues. It can affect blood flow to the area, yeah. But it's a tough thing. As a surgeon, if I don't stop that bleeding, I can't see, right? You have to be able to see what it is you're taking on and moving in. So anyway, great conversation about clotting. Platelets are a huge part of that. They're like little tiny, they're like fragments of these red blood cells that help with this clotting. The last piece of our formed elements are the white blood cells. Notice that's only 0.01%, right? And there's much more detail about the 5 different types. We'll get to that in a little bit. I don't want to talk about that today. But know what is white blood cells? What's the big thing that these guys are doing? Immunity. Fighting bacteria, fighting viruses, though you can't really fight viruses, but trying to keep the bad things out of our body, right? Very potent, right? You don't need oodles and oodles of them to do the job they need to do well. There's a very specific level of them. If they take your blood and they see your white blood cell count is elevated, that means there's an infection somewhere, right? There's some sort of problem going on. It'll pop more out, and yes, send more in, absolutely. Absolutely. We good? So 3 main pieces as far as the formed elements, the actual tissue pieces in the blood, right? Platelets, red blood cells, white blood cells. Now we move over to the plasma portion. And again, that's that that yellowish, it is kind of clearish. Has anybody ever given blood here? Like a blood, donated blood? Nicely done. I would highly encourage you, if you are old enough and you weigh enough, because sometimes ladies, that's a difficulty. There's a certain amount you have to weigh. I would highly encourage you. It's like the easiest thing you can do that makes a huge difference in the world. Has anybody given plasma? Out of those of you who've given blood, have you ever given plasma? Yeah, it's very cool. Basically, what they do is they take your blood out, and they literally put it through a little centrifuge. It's all one machine. It comes out into this machine. It spins it. It takes the plasma out and puts the red blood cells, the formed elements, back into your blood. It takes longer. Again, it's all one. In other words, you don't use the same spinner that I do. It's all sterile. But they want that plasma piece, again, for these trauma-type things where they want to get you more blood rapidly. No, that's fine. You'll just need to drink more water. Because, again, plasma is mostly water, right? Right. They have literally a whole sheet full of questions that if you answer any of those wrong, yes. Yeah. Yep. Stay with me, friends. Shh, shh, shh. Okay, part of the plasma. Again, 92% of the plasma is what? Water. Okay? Which, again, highlights how important it is for us to keep drinking. I'm thirsty as I say that, right? We move on. The main part of the rest of the blood is what? Of the plasma, excuse me. What's the next biggest part? The proteins, okay? And again, we're going to talk much more in depth about what these proteins are. The albumins, the globulins, the fibrinogens. If you were looking to see more about that, and again, this is over on page 336, in your textbook. Quickly, the albumins help to maintain the osmotic pressure in the bloodstream, so it helps to balance the amount of fluid in the blood. The globulins help transport fats, and the fibrinogens help with the clotting. They're actually the fibers that kind of make up the clot, that kind of hold the clot closed to allow the other cells to come and make a scab, a clot. We'll talk more about those guys. So 92 plus 7 is 99%, right? So most of your plasma is water and proteins. But then you also have these other pieces put in, which are all still very important, right? Electrolytes are things like potassium and calcium and sodium. And as we've gone through the systems, you've seen how important those are, right? For the muscular system to fire, you need potassium and sodium. For the nervous system to work, you need potassium and sodium. For your bones to make bone, you need calcium, right? These electrolytes are in the blood, so they can be transported around where they're needed. Sure, right, but and that interstitial fluid comes from the blood. It's basically the osmotic pressure sometimes will pull out more of that fluid, more of that plasma into between the cells. Yeah, it's a good question. Not now. Stop. All right, let's keep going. When I say, oh, yes, sir, question. So at the far end of things, it would mean organ shutdown and death. Like if you get, so for example, have you heard of the fact that we don't drink too much water? Like we don't drink enough water, right? So they have, I was just reading an article about this. They haven't really ever shown somebody to die just from not having enough water. Usually there's other pieces that are involved there. But there are deaths where people drink too much water. You say, wait, what? Here's an example. First-time marathon runner. They know, hey, I got to drink, I got to drink, I got to drink. So they keep drinking lots and lots of water. What happens is it literally dilutes the blood. There's too much water and not enough of the electrolytes and those kind of things present. And so you can die. You're almost like drowning yourself. There's too much fluid in the blood. It's very strange, very rare. It basically is, or college kids who, hey, let's drink this whole gallon of water like in a minute, yeah. That's how they sound too, just like that, right? And again, unless immediately they're vomiting that or something, it can significantly dilute the blood. Yeah, so that would be the worst case scenario. Much less than that would be, let's say, athletic performance. You're dehydrated, not enough electrolytes. You can't perform what you normally, not as well as you normally would be able to. Where do we hear electrolytes an awful lot? We talked about sports, but in Gatorade, right? Yeah. That's what you hear. Is that mostly marketing? Yes. Okay, you really don't need. And it's mostly sugar, to be honest with you. That's where Gatorade gets most of its power, is it sugar, right? Do I drink it? Yes. Is it good? Yes. But water works just as well. Wastes would be, again, cellular product wastes from your metabolism. There's not really much in your book about that. But know that that's kind of dumping grounds. The blood is where your cells would dump these things into to be transported to the kidneys to be peed out. Think of urea, the uric acid that you pee out. That's what we're dealing with there. Nutrients, vitamins, those make sense, right? What you're eating, the proteins, the carbohydrates, the fats that we're eating, right? They'll be transported on the blood, so you'll certainly find them there. The hormones, we just finished the whole unit on the endocrine system. How do hormones travel? Through the blood, and they're just kind of dissolved in the plasma there. And then last but not least, the gases that are present in our blood. You always think about oxygen and carbon dioxide, because we're breathing out carbon dioxide, we're breathing in oxygen, though truthfully we do both, right? We breathe in carbon dioxide, we breathe out oxygen too, right? And if you have any doubt why this would be the case, think about giving CPR to somebody. If you only breathed out carbon dioxide and somebody's dying, and I breathe, I would make them die faster. Kind of defeat the point, right? You still have tons of oxygen in the breath you're breathing out. And you've only have a slight bit of carbon dioxide. Now, it's about 100 times more than when you breathe in, because your body's putting that waste product into that exhaled air. But there's still tons of oxygen that's present there. But most of us don't think about nitrogen. That nitrogen is a big part of the gases in our blood. Yes, ma'am. There's really no harm with just pure oxygen per se. The difficulty is things around pure oxygen are very flammable. Oxygen itself is not flammable, but a lot of other things, if I have pure oxygen, a tiny little something will cause a humongous fire. Does that make sense? Any kind of fuel that's present there. Any sort of something that is flammable that burns. So, again, very rarely do we... So let's say this. If we're going up into space, if we're in a capsule, or we're in, let's say, our Mars lander sometime, or the actual hut we put on Mars, probably won't have a bunch of nitrogen there. Like, there's really no reason for it, right? But often they'll put some other kind of inert gas, so it's not just pure oxygen there. Because again, it's just too easy for things to catch on fire. Or they'll make sure anything they pack is very difficult to burn. Does that make sense? Right. Oh, no, yeah, no, this would not be a good thing. Yeah. You're talking about in space. Yeah. Any sort of lighter or flammable some things. It is. Right, and that's why that's dissolved in our blood. Because we are breathing in mostly nitrogen, right? And so some of that nitrogen does dissolve in our blood. Does anybody know of a condition or a problem where that nitrogen in your blood can come back to haunt you? The bends. Has anybody heard of that? Not Mercedes-Benz. The bends is a diving thing. So again, when you dive, there's more pressure on you from the water, right? That pressure actually causes more of this nitrogen to be dissolved in your blood than normal, right? As you come back up, and the other gases too, not just nitrogen. As you come back up, you have to ascend slowly so that those bubbles of gas can come out of your blood. Does that make sense? Think about a soda, right? Before you open it, do you see a bunch of bubbles? No, because there's pressure, right? It's a pressurized container. When I undo that pressure, do you see bubbles? Absolutely. Does that make sense? So the pressure causes the carbon dioxide in your soda to be dissolved in the soda. Does that make sense? Okay. And if you do this too fast, if you ascend too quickly, oh man, super painful. Those bubbles get lodged in your joints, knees, backs, hips, and significantly painful. I've never dealt with it myself, but I've seen videos and heard stories of people, and it's just brutal. And you can die from it if those bubbles are in your brain. And again, think about just quickly expanding your brain tissue with bubble, right? Yeah, this is not very pleasant.
So with like taking in straight oxygen, is that not good for football players that like?
No, that's fine. That's trying to recover because they've got more oxygen. There are guys who sleep in these hyperbaric tents that are basically pure oxygen. Yeah, it's all a recovery thing. You're trying to get more oxygen into your system to recover faster. Depends on how long it takes. Again, let's say you're doing an emergency surface, and it depends on how deep you are. Because the further down you are, the more pressure, so the more gas is dissolved, and quickly then comes out of your bloodstream. So it is lots of different pieces. It can be something that you're painful, but that goes away. It can be causing permanent damage or even death at the worst. Yeah. Okay, so there's your blood. Maybe you didn't realize that there was this much stuff in your blood. In truth, this diagram encapsulates all of chapter 12. Chapter 12 goes through the details, and there's a little bit more on the end of it, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But I do want you to do the questions. Understand there's going to be 2 sets of questions, and I realize it's a lot, but I do want you to do them because it's helpful, I think, if you do them. Not if you get your neighbor's questions, but if you do them. So Friday, I'm telling you for these questions. We'll give you into the next week, Monday, for the chapter 13 questions. It's next Friday, not this Friday coming, but the one after, if I'm not mistaken. And yes, you guys are gone. We need to talk. Those of you who are going to be gone, we need to talk about what the plan is for you as far as taking this assessment. Okay? We've got about 7, 8 minutes. I love for you to start on the questions. Okay? Go for it.